What's going on, everybody? So I spent 4 days with the Nintendo Switch 2 and tested over 40 games in my personal time and on the channel. And I decided before the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct on June 12th, I should give my final thoughts and review on the console handheld hybrid. And so far, everything on the Nintendo Switch 2 has more personality than the first. The startup intro has charming music that's very Wii-esque and brings me back to the old Nintendo days. In fact, I've used the Nintendo Switch 2's setup music in a couple of my videos. But it's not only the setup music that has more personality, each icon has a particular sound effect that represents it. Even the eShop has a lot more personality with the way it looks and feels, directly comparing it to the first Switch. And going further into the eShop, I feel like this is one of the biggest changes from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. The eShop is worlds faster on the Switch 2 than it was in the first. The Switch 1's eShop was, without exaggeration, a total disaster from day 1 to year 8. And the Switch 2's eShop is a complete departure of what we used to know and loathe about the first. It's snappier, it actually looks cool, it's screen friendly. I remember every time I go into the eShop, I worry that my screen was going to burn in on my Switch OLED because everything was completely white and orange. But now the eShop is black and red, which looks very appropriate to the Switch 2's theme. It has more of a cooler look than the first, and it's 100 times faster. So you can really see the hardware progression just in the eShop alone. But going further into the personality of the eShop, there's actually a For You section that gives you recommendations based on the games you've downloaded before. And of course, there is a lot of shovelware, so you're going to see a lot of shovelware in that recommended section. And I just wish they would remove some of that shovelware because the Switch 2 really doesn't need that. And I can't reiterate how much I love the eShop on the Switch 2. I think it's one of the best e-stores that I've ever used, and that's counting Steam. I feel like Steam is a little bit convoluted on the Steam Deck with its verification system, and you have to uncheck the verification system to actually get the games you want because most likely the game that isn't verified is going to work anyway. But you get the gist. It is complicated on other very popular e-stores. And getting into the actual gaming of it, Nintendo Switch 1 games run at lightning speed and load extremely quick on the Switch 2. Loading times on Switch 2 games do vary, but Hitman World of Assassins, even though that game doesn't perform very well, loads very fast compared to games that were pushing the Switch 1. And besides the loading times, the performance for one of the most popular third-party games on the Switch 2, which is Cyberpunk 2077, works exceptionally well, and it's pretty much at a smooth 30 FPS in handheld and docked mode. In quality mode and in performance, Cyberpunk 2077 goes a steady 40 FPS. And the performance and loading times are a result of having better hardware, better internal memory, and also using the Express microSD cards. Now, the Express microSD cards have a read speed of 900 megabits per second, and that's about 10 times faster than the average microSD card that we would get around 8 years ago. But if you wanted to get an Express microSD card for your Switch 2, well, it's going to run you about $60 to $80 for a 256 gigabyte, and to get a 1 terabyte, especially from GameStop, you're going to have to spend close to $200 after taxes. And unfortunately, these Express microSD cards are the only memory cards that work with the Nintendo Switch 2, so if you wanted to use the dozens of SD cards you accumulated over time from getting PC handhelds and the first Nintendo Switch, especially if you bought multiple Switch 1s and placed multiple microSD cards inside of each, those SD cards are pretty much useless. You're going to need Express instead of the normal one. So you might want to wait a little bit of time, but if you just want to get a 256 gigabyte for a good price, at Walmart they have something called the ON Express microSD cards, and I used to get those all the time for the first Switch when it wasn't Express. The price for the original microSD card from ON is $30 and the Express microSD card is $35, so it's not a bad deal, especially the fact that you get around 800 megabits per second with it. But all of my games from Street Fighter, Hitman to Fast RMX work perfectly fine with the ON Express microSD card, and it's going to take some getting used to say Express microSD card all the time, so that's my biggest annoyance with it currently. And getting into the display of the Switch 2, the resolution has smaller pixel density, so something like a 1080p display on this 7.9 inch actually looks similar to either 2K or even 4K at times. The sharpness of the screen is staggering. And that, coupled with HDR and VRR, makes for an exceptional experience while playing a game like Cyberpunk 2077 on a Switch 2. Just saying that is unbelievable. But the pixel density, the resolution, and the screen size, along with all of those other features, is something to be reckoned with compared to something like the Steam Deck OLED. Yes, a part of me couldn't tell the difference between the Steam Deck OLED screen and the Switch 2's 1080p HDR screen. The HDR on the Switch 2, but some people are saying they can't really tell if HDR is on or not. I feel with games like Breath of the Wild, you can tell that HDR is active. But with Cyberpunk, you can definitely tell it's active because there are a lot of darker and lighter areas because of the cyberpunk aesthetic of the game. So you're going to see a lot of neon lights at nighttime, and the HDR really pops out while looking at signposts or advertisements in the street in Night City. And of course, Night City looks best at night, especially thanks to the HDR. And playing games while docked now feels a lot more premium, in my opinion, and the experience is comparable to consoles like PlayStation 4 and yes, even PlayStation 5. I feel like if I were to have Cyberpunk 2077 for the PlayStation 5, it would look similar to how the Switch 2's port looks. The experience you get in dock mode is a lot more serviceable on the Switch 2. In fact, I think it's about 100 times better than the Switch 1's docked mode. Switch 1's docked mode was just fine. It made certain games like Doom Eternal look better, but the resolution was 720p most of the time. So to have a game run at 1080p and sometimes 4K while docking the Switch 2 is a huge departure from what we had on the Switch 1. This feels like a Nintendo Switch 2 Pro at times while playing 4K. It's a huge jump in quality during docked mode, and I feel like this is what makes the Switch 2 more of a console than a hybrid comparing it to the Switch 1, especially with the Switch 2's size, but we'll get into that later. Now, talking about the sound quality, the speakers are very clear, very crisp, and bassy most of the time. I never had the urge to use headphones opposed to using the Switch 2 speakers. I feel like they're very loud. I'm not sure what the DPI is on them, but they sound louder than a lot of other speakers I've used, and the speakers are very thin as well as the console, so to have the sound quality that good as well as loud and bassy is very surprising. But it's also not surprising because Nintendo probably mastered speaker quality with the Switch OLED, since that one is the thinnest and the loudest handheld between all of the Switch 1 models. But the Switch 2 sounds a lot better than the Switch OLED in terms of volume and clarity. And getting into the physical features of the Switch 2, the Switch 2 this time around feels a lot more premium. The plastic used is higher grade, the aesthetic quality is similar to what you would get on a Switch OLED, but even better than that. The quality of the Switch 2 is only comparable to something like an iPhone. It looks like it was made by a billion-dollar company, which also spent millions of dollars just designing the thing. And yes, it is a larger handheld than the Switch 1. Its size can even be comparable to something like the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally, but it's a lot thinner than any PC handheld I've ever used because, well, it's made by Nintendo, so they wanted to perfect its dimensions to make it actually portable. And even though it is thinner, it is also taller and wider. So at some points, it actually feels like you're using an iPad opposed to a handheld because the whole thing is just flat. It's not very ergonomic. I used it for about 2.5 hours straight and my pinky started to cramp up, but it's extremely light, so my arm didn't really fall asleep or anything like that. It was just a little uncomfortable after holding it for about 2 hours. And that's saying a lot because while holding something like a Steam Deck, after 30 minutes, my arm starts to fall asleep because that thing is heavy. Even though they made it lighter, it is one of the heaviest PC handhelds out there. But the Nintendo Switch 2's weight is nothing compared to the PC handhelds that I have. So holding it is no problem. The only thing I have a problem with is the ergonomics. The Switch 2 will need grips eventually. Even though it's not very hard to leave fingerprints on the system, the main problem is actually going to be if you have a decent grip on your $450 handheld and enough protection for it. And while the Switch 2 kind of feels like it's naked the first time you use it, it doesn't feel like it's well fortified, and there's absolutely zero grip on it. So when people say that the ergonomics are a lot better than the Switch 1, I guess starting from nothing and going to kind of more is an improvement, but it's still an improvement over nothing. The Switch 1 had no ergonomics at all. So adding a grip to your Switch 2 is going to be essential, and that will add to the weight of it. So be very cautious of what kind of grips you add onto your Switch 2, because that's going to make it even heavier and potentially more uncomfy. And besides playing games, being on the eShop, and scouring for new games on the Switch 2 for the next few months, like a lot of people are going to do after they finish Cyberpunk 2077 and they get enough playtime with Mario Kart World. I think the question on everybody's minds at the end of the day is, how long does the Nintendo Switch 2's battery last? Now, as you saw with one of my shorts, I managed to get 2 hours and 24 minutes with Cyberpunk 2077. Now, that can be comparable with Cyberpunk at 1080p on something like an ROG Ally X. Most likely you're not going to get the smoothest experience with the ROG Ally X at 1080p with Cyberpunk running at around 30 to 40 FPS. Most likely you're going to have to run it at turbo mode. And with turbo mode with the ROG Ally X, you get around 2 hours and 30 minutes. But don't forget, a PC handheld like the ROG Ally X has an 80 watt-hour battery inside, while the Nintendo Switch 2 has only a 20 watt-hour battery. So considering you can get that kind of battery life with Cyberpunk 2077 with a battery that's 8 times smaller, like something that you get on the ROG Ally X, I think that's incredibly impressive. I didn't expect to play Cyberpunk over an hour and 30 minutes, but I managed to get a good amount of time with it. And that's important because I'm going to bring this thing across the country very soon, so look out for potential vlogs with the Nintendo Switch 2 on that big road trip. This is the main reason I wanted to make sure exactly how long every game would last, and I'm going to continue to test games to see how long they last. The next one on the list, even though it makes me kind of sick to play it, is Hitman World of Assassins. I really hope that a patch is going to be released for that game very soon, because the FPS is very uneven. It's not low, it's just uneven. And speaking of FPS, VRR is a godsend on the Switch 2. Almost every game feels exceptionally smooth because of it, especially Switch 1 games. Now, I'm not sure if you saw, but I posted gameplay of Resident Evil 6 running on the Switch 2. Now that thing, because of VRR and the high FPS, feels like it's running at 120 FPS. Now that is actually the best experience I had with Resident Evil 6 on any handheld. It's terrible on the Steam Deck, it's terrible on the ROG Ally, it's almost unplayable on the Legion Go, so my only option was to try to play it on the Switch 2, and it seemed like it managed to go even above 60, which is so amazing because I wanted to replay that game so bad, but I wasn't able to on any of my PC handhelds, and now the Switch 2 has enabled not only a playable Resident Evil 6, with it being the best version of Resident Evil 6, by the way, because you can switch costumes during the campaign opposed to the PC versions where you can't. But not only that, it runs at 60 FPS and even higher at times. It feels like it, at least. I need some kind of FPS monitor to get legitimate data on this, but it felt buttery smooth. So yes, Switch 1 games definitely benefit from the Switch 2's VRR screen. And not only do Switch 1 games work better because of the hardware, but it's also because you have a lot faster internal memory, along with the express SD card that you're inevitably going to store your Switch 1 games into. Having an 800 to 900 megabit per second SD card is definitely going to help with loading times with all of the Switch games, and yes, they all load in about 5 to 6 seconds. And a lot of Switch 1 games in the past used dynamic resolution, and because you're playing on faster micro SD card or internal space booted by better hardware, you're not going to see any of that dynamic resolution. So games like No More Heroes 3 is going to look better because the dynamic resolution is not going to be there, while games like Bayonetta 3 will also benefit from this, and you won't see that dynamic resolution for 90% of the time. When you do summon those giant demons, you will most likely see some kind of dynamic resolution on the effects of the game, but besides those moments, even games like Bayonetta 3 run and look a lot better because of the lack of dynamic resolution. And my personal favorite game that I tested recently was Ninja Gaiden 3. Now that game had the worst dynamic resolution because of how fast-paced it was, and on the Nintendo Switch 2, Ninja Gaiden 3 runs with perfectly stable resolution and also at 60 FPS. So because of the Switch 2's hardware bump, it made Ninja Gaiden 3 on the Switch 2 the best version, and it instantly made me look into actually getting a 1TB so I could put even more Switch 1 games on my Switch 2. And I actually bought the Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour just to try out mouse mode, because I don't have any other game to try that feature out with. And honestly, mouse mode is pretty okay. It's very accurate, and you can actually rotate the Joy-Con 2 in order to get a better angle. I tried it on my desk, but I think you can manage on any surface while playing in mouse mode. I'm not exactly sure how mouse mode will be incorporated into different games, but I think if Nintendo added mouse mode to those touchscreen games like The World Ends With You and Wonderful 101, since you could switch between controller and mouse mode so quickly, theoretically, that could make it possible to utilize the touchscreen function of certain titles in docked mode. So I like the idea simply because I want to play more touchscreen games while docked. But as far as first person, I haven't been able to try it with any game so far, or at least I haven't gotten up to that point in Welcome Tour. And moving on, I actually haven't tried the game chat feature. It's mostly because I use Discord and I didn't really have any people or friends on my Nintendo Switch because you have to collect their extremely long friend code. It's just so convoluted to add people on the Switch. I'm not sure if the Switch 2 makes that process of adding a friend a lot easier, but I have a lot more people on Discord and just on my phone. So I didn't really find a purpose to using the game chat feature, so I can't review that, unfortunately. I didn't buy a camera or set up a camera with my Switch 2 either. I just mainly got this thing to play games and not really use some kind of ambiguous game chat feature. And besides everything else, when it comes down to it, the Nintendo Switch 2 is a remarkable piece of tech that rivals the Steam Deck and other Powerhouse handhelds without even trying. Its 1080p display, slim build, and premium experience is what makes the Nintendo Switch 2 a powerful handheld with a good personality. While its game prices still need fixing, so far it's been an amazing time with the Switch 2. And even though Nintendo is known for being ambitious to a fault, and the Switch 2 may not introduce anything particularly new from the Switch 1 era, its sequel proves that the magic of a console comes from the company and not particularly the hardware of the console. And when it comes to seamlessness, the Switch 2 is the best at it. Switching from docked to handheld mode is just as smooth, if not even smoother, than it was with the Switch 1. And I can't wait until June 12th to see what else Nintendo has up their sleeves with the Switch 2. It seems like there's a lot of potential with this handheld console hybrid, and so far I'm pretty much bought. And that's not to say mistakes won't be made in the future. Like with Hitman World of Assassins, that game leaves a lot to be desired in terms of performance because the FPS isn't locked, but for some reason the VRR still doesn't help while playing it in handheld. And the docked experience with that game isn't good at all, in my opinion. But that's something that a patch could fix, because Hitman does look absolutely perfect. It looks very similar to something like a high-end PC version of it. But regardless of that one port that didn't make it, I for one can't wait to see what Nintendo has in store for this powerhouse of a handheld. And my personal score for the Nintendo Switch 2 is a 9 out of 10. It's an almost perfect handheld with things like game keycards, its ergonomics, and slight battery life disappointments, as well as certain games not meeting performance standards, could hold back the experience slightly, but those aren't anywhere near to being deal breakers. I've never been this impressed by a handheld, especially while playing Cyberpunk 2077. And even after everything I've seen in the past 3 years with PC handhelds, the Switch 2 still impressed me very much so. The fact that I was still impressed in any way, even after all I've seen, is something that Nintendo should be proud of. They've really made quite the handheld here. And I still can't believe the thing hasn't overheated on me. But all of this is enough to revive my hope for the future in this handheld console hybrid. And I can't wait to see what the future holds. But let me know what you guys think about the Nintendo Switch 2. Have you gotten enough sessions with this handheld to make your final verdict? Yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Later.